The kind of silence that fills a room full of dangerous men isn't empty. It has weight. It presses against your eardrums, settles into your chest, makes every sound. The soft clink of a crystal glass, the scrape of a fork against porcelain, feel like a gunshot. Nadia Ose had learned to breathe inside that silence. 4 years as a bookkeeper for Aurelius and Mace Private Holdings had taught her many things she never asked to know. How to read a man's mood from 15 feet away. How to make herself smaller in a room already crowded with egos. How to disappear into plain sight. She was good at disappearing. At 29, she was the kind of woman who got looked through rather than looked at. Not because she was unremarkable, but because the men who moved through these spaces simply didn't bother to focus their eyes on someone like her. Too soft around the edges, they probably thought, if they thought of her at all. Her curves, her quiet voice, the way she never raised her chin in rooms like this. She wore sensible heels and cardigan sets to every quarterly gala Aurelius and Mace hosted at the Whitmore Club. She carried a leather portfolio no one ever asked to see. She smiled at the right moments, refilled her own water glass, and kept every number she'd ever seen inside these walls locked behind her teeth. Tonight was no different, except for the thing she overheard in the coat room at 7:43. She hadn't meant to be there. The hem of her navy dress had caught on the brass hook behind the door, a stupid, small disaster, and she ducked behind the velvet partition to free herself just as the 2 men slipped inside. They didn't see her. No one ever did. Whitmore's people are already in the east corridor, 3 of them. The other 2 are coming through the kitchen after 9, and the accountant confirmed the route? A pause. The sound of a lighter clicking. She confirmed everything. The man doesn't know. She knew that voice. It belonged to a man named Fletcher Pruitt, Regional Director of Operations per his business card. Per her ledgers, he was the one funneling 6 figures a month through a shell company registered in Delaware that didn't legally exist. She had flagged it twice. Both times the report had come back to her desk unsigned, with the word reviewed stamped on the cover page in red. She had stopped flagging it after that. The other voice she didn't recognize. Low, clipped, the kind of accent that had been worked out of a man over years of expensive schooling, though you could still hear what was underneath it if you listened closely enough. What time does Kane arrive? 8:15. Nadia Ose stopped breathing. Kane. She knew that name the way everyone in a 3-state radius who worked adjacent to the underworld knew it. Carefully, the way you know a word in a foreign language for something that can kill you. Adrian Kane, 41 years old, ran the most impenetrable private financial empire east of the Mississippi, with interests in shipping, real estate, and things that didn't get written down anywhere. The kind of man governments consulted quietly and prosecutors avoided publicly. The kind of man who walked into a room and made the air rearrange itself around him. Fletcher Pruitt and the clipped accent stranger were not discussing Adrian Kane the way colleagues discuss a scheduled arrival. They were discussing him the way hunters discuss an animal that doesn't know it's being tracked. The East Corridor. 5 men. After 9. Nadia's hand was still caught on the brass hook. She freed it without looking down and stood perfectly still until the 2 men left. Then she stood still for another 30 seconds because her legs had stopped working and her mind was running the numbers on what she'd just heard with the same detached precision she brought to every ledger she'd ever opened. 5 men, 1 route, 1 window. She had 40 minutes. The Whitmore Club's main dining room was everything that word implied. Chandelier light heavy as honey, the smell of wood smoke and old money, a string quartet doing something forgettable near the east windows. Nadia crossed the room twice before she spotted him. He was seated alone at a corner table with the kind of stillness that powerful men cultivate. Not relaxed, exactly, but deliberate. Every inch of him arranged. Dark suit, no tie. The first 2 buttons of his shirt undone in a way that somehow looked more formal than anyone else's black tie. He was speaking to no one, looking at something on the table in front of him, and every other person in the room was unconsciously angling their body toward him the way plants angle toward light. He didn't seem to notice, or maybe he noticed everything and simply didn't care. Adrian Kane. Nadia walked toward him. She told herself she was simply doing what any reasonable person would do with the information she had. She told herself it was a math problem. 5 men minus 1 warning equals 0 casualties, and she had always been good at math. She did not tell herself what her heartbeat was doing. 12 feet from his table, she felt the first of his security detail notice her. A man built like a doorframe, stationed near the window, whose eyes had been tracking the room in a slow sweep and now locked onto her with the particular quality of attention she'd spent years specifically trying to avoid. She kept walking. She was a bookkeeper. She attended events like this 4 times a year. She knew where the bathroom was. She knew which table the Whitmore Club reserved for private guests. She knew the name of the maitre and the vintage of the Barolo they were serving tonight, and the exact number Hepsimust between the east corridor and the kitchen exit. She was invisible here. That was the whole point. Nadia reached the edge of Adrian Kane's table. She did not look at the man near the window. She picked up the empty cocktail glass in front of the adjacent seat, as though she had every right to it, and set it on her tray. She produced a fresh napkin from her portfolio. She set it on the table. She was not a waitress, and for 37 seconds she was. She set the notepad down on top of it, just for a moment. Just long enough for her to press her pen to the page and write, fast, clean, block letters, the way she'd written every important note she'd ever taken, the way you write when you know someone else needs to read it quickly and understand it perfectly. Fletcher Pruitt. 5 men. East corridor and kitchen. 9 p.m. You are the target. I work for Aurelius and Mace. If you want proof, I have the ledgers. She folded the note once and slid it under the edge of his water glass as she lifted the cocktail glass away. She did not look at him. She turned to leave. Sit down. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the particular quality of a sound that the room unconsciously quieted itself around, and it was directed at her with a precision that made clear he had not simply spoken into the air. Nadia turned back. Adrian Kane was holding the folded note and looking at her the way no one in 4 years had ever looked at her, with complete, undivided, absolute attention. Like she was the only person in the room. Like she had walked in through the front door and every head had turned. She sat down. "What's your name?" he said. He hadn't opened the note. "Nadia Osei. I'm a bookkeeper. I work the quarterlies for Aurelius and Mace. How long have you been standing in this room?" I arrived at 6:30. The coat room is behind the velvet partition at the south entrance. The brass hook on the inside of the door catches on chiffon and similar fabrics. Something shifted in his expression. Nothing dramatic, just a narrowing, the kind of recalibration that a man performs when he encounters information that doesn't fit his existing model of the world. He opened the note. She watched him read it. His face didn't change. Men like Adrian Kane had learned the same things she had, how to receive information without broadcasting your response. But she caught it anyway. The slight tension at the corner of his jaw, the way his eyes moved back to the first line and read it again. "Fletcher Pruitt is Regional Director of Operations at Aurelius and Mace," he said. "Technically. He also controls a Delaware shell company with no registered employees that's received over $900,000 in 18 months. I flagged it twice. The reports came back stamped but unsigned." She paused. "I kept copies." "Of course you did." He said it without judgment, almost with something like recognition. "You've been sitting on that for how long?" 8 months. I didn't know who it was for until tonight." A small pause. "I didn't know what it was for until I heard him say your name." Adrian Kane looked at her for a long moment. Not the way men usually looked at her, or didn't look at her. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at contracts, at balance sheets, at proposals that came across his desk from people whose competence was still being determined. Assessing. Precise. "You came directly to me," he said, "in a room full of my people, without knowing who might be watching." "I knew Fletcher's associate was somewhere in the main dining room," she said, "but I'd already placed him near the bar. He hadn't looked my way all evening. People rarely do." "Why is that?" She held his gaze. "Because I'm good at not being worth looking at." The words came out flatter than she intended, stripped of self-pity by simple repetition. She'd known this about herself so long it had stopped being a wound and become a tool. But something moved across Adrian Kane's face at that. Not pity, not discomfort, something closer to sharp attention. "Read," he said quietly, to no one she could see. Immediately, the man near the window was at his elbow. Adrian Kane passed him the note and spoke 3 words so low she couldn't hear them. The man near the window was gone again in 15 seconds. Adrian Kane turned back to her. "The ledger copies," he said. "Where are they?" "I have scanned images. Encrypted. They'll go to 3 separate email addresses on a 48-hour delay if I don't manually cancel the send." He looked at her again with that particular calibration. "That's either very smart or very trusting." "It's both," she said. "I need you to know I'm not disposable before you decide I'm inconvenient." The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. She counted. Then something happened at the edge of Adrian Kane's mouth. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. The kind of expression a man makes when he encounters a thing he didn't expect and finds it interesting rather than threatening. "Where did you work before Aurelius and Mace?" he asked. 2 years at Meridian Capital. Before that I was in forensic accounting at a firm in Baltimore. Forensic accounting. I find things people are trying to hide." She looked at him steadily. "I'm very good at it." At 8:53, Adrian Kane rose from his table and left the room through the north entrance. He said nothing else to her. He didn't need to. Before he stood, he passed his phone across the table for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough for her to see the screen, the message already drafted, the words confirmed and handled sitting in the send field. And then he put it back in his pocket. She sat at the corner table and finished her water and watched the east corridor from across the room. At 9:04, 2 of his people walked Fletcher Pruitt out of the building so quietly that the string quartet didn't miss a note. The associates near the kitchen door were handled with similar efficiency. None of it was dramatic. None of it was visible to anyone not specifically watching for it. That was the thing about men like Adrian Kane. They didn't make scenes. The scene had already been written by the time you arrived. She left at 9:30 and did not think about him. Except that she did. She thought about the way he'd looked at her. Not through her. She sent the ledgers to his attorney at 9:08 the following morning. By noon, she had received a formal notification that Aurelius and Mace Private Holdings had entered into a period of internal audit review. By 3 in the afternoon, Fletcher Pruitt's office was empty, and the building administrator had already begun removing his name from the directory. Nadia sat at her desk and kept working. She always kept working. There was comfort in numbers, in the way they didn't lie, in the way 2 + 2 was never going to meet you in the coat room with 5 hired men and a plan. She was deep in a reconciliation for a Vancouver subsidiary when her desk phone rang. "Mrs. Osei." She knew the voice immediately. She hadn't been expecting it, and she was proud of the fact that she answered in the same measured tone she used with every caller, with nothing in her voice that wasn't already supposed to be there. "Mr. Kane, I'd like to offer you a position." She set down her pen. "I'm listening. Head of Forensic Finance. You'd have full access to the books across all operating entities, a direct reporting line to me, and the authority to flag anything without it coming back damped and unsigned." She looked at the framed print on the wall across from her desk, a generic mountain landscape she'd inherited with the office, and never bothered to replace. "You don't know me," she said. "I know you kept 9 months of documented financial fraud in an encrypted file as an insurance policy, and then handed it to the right person at the right moment at significant personal risk." A pause. "That's more than I know about most of my senior staff. I was protecting myself," she said. "Not you. I know that too." His voice was even, unhurried. "That's what makes it useful. People who act purely in their own interest are predictable. People who also acted correctly while doing it are rare." She was quiet for a moment. Outside her window, a city bus hissed to a stop. Somewhere down the hall, 2 colleagues were arguing about something that had nothing to do with any of this. "I'll need a full benefits package and complete operational independence," she said. "No one clears my reports before they reach your desk." "Agreed. And I want the Delaware Shell Company documentation included in any legal proceedings. Not buried. It already is." She picked her pen back up, looked at the mountain landscape, made a decision. "I'll send a formal acceptance by end of day," she said. "I'll have my office prepare the paperwork." Another pause, shorter than the last. "One more thing. Yes, last night. When you walked across that room, you said people rarely looked at you, that you made yourself not worth looking at." He let that sit for a moment. "I want you to know that I noticed you the moment you walked through the door, before the note. I just didn't know yet why I was paying attention." The line was quiet. "Goodbye, Mr. Kane," she said. "Goodbye, Ms. O.C." She started on the 1st of the month. His offices were on the 42nd floor of a building in the financial district that didn't have a name on the lobby directory, just a suite number and a small brass plate that read AC, holdings in letters that cost more than most people's rent and were designed to be easily missed. She had expected that. She had not expected the library. One entire wall of her new office was lined with books. Real ones, not decorative, with a rolling ladder on a brass track and a reading chair in the corner that had been used so many times the leather had worn soft in specific places. Someone had put an orchid on the desk. She stood in the doorway for a moment looking at it, the orchid and the books and the chair with its worn-in places, and felt something shift in her chest that she didn't fully examine. She was good at not examining things that didn't belong in the ledger. The work itself was absorbing, in the way good work always was, clean and purposeful, with a kind of order underneath the complexity that her mind could sink into and move through easily. She found 4 additional irregularities in the first 3 weeks. 2 were legacy issues from a previous administration, easy to document and resolve. 1 was a billing error, genuinely accidental, caught before it compounded. The 4th required a conversation. She requested a meeting. His assistant, a man named Croft, built like a retired athlete, whose efficiency Nadia deeply respected, put her on the calendar for Tuesday at 2. She arrived at 2 on the dot. She always arrived on time. It was one of the small disciplines she'd kept since graduate school, the ones that had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations of her, and everything to do with her own. Adrian Kane was already seated at the head of the conference table when she walked in. He looked the same as he had at the Whitmore Club, and exactly how she'd seen him every morning since she started when she passed him in the corridor. Self-contained, present, watchful. But there was something different about the room when it was just the 2 of them, and the city spread behind the glass behind him, and she identified it quickly. She was not performing invisibility. She hadn't been, not once in the 42 days since she started. She set the file on the table and opened it. "There's a routing discrepancy in the Harmon Group account," she said. "It's small, 12,000 over 6 quarters, but the pattern is deliberate. Whoever set it up knew exactly where the threshold markers were. Whoever set it up is no longer with the company," he said. He'd looked at the file for 4 seconds. "They were removed in the audit." "I know. But the flag is still live, which means the corrections weren't filed properly, which means there's a window." She tapped the second page. I can close it. I just need your sign-off, since it touches the Harmon Group directly, and they're a named client. He looked at her for a moment, not at the file. At her. You didn't need a meeting for that, he said. No, you could have sent a memo. I could have. He leaned back in his chair slightly. The light from the window was behind him, and in it she noticed what she'd been carefully not noticing for 6 weeks. The quality of attention he gave her, which was the same in every room, in every context, with or without an audience. Complete. Unperformed. Why didn't you? He asked. She looked at him steadily the way she had across a corner table at the Whitmore Club on a night she had expected to be entirely unremarkable. Because I wanted to see if you'd notice, she said. A silence, longer than 3 seconds this time. Notice what? That I wasn't hiding. She kept her voice even. It took effort, but she'd had a lot of practice with effort, and she knew how to spend it. I've spent a long time making myself smaller in rooms, taking up less space, being the person who doesn't need to be seen to do useful things. She closed the file. I've been here 6 weeks, and I haven't done it once. I want to know if that's something you see. Adrian Kane looked at her for so long that she became aware of every sound in the building around them. The ventilation system, a distant phone, the city below. I told you, he said quietly. I noticed you before you walked across the room. That's not the same thing. No, he agreed. It isn't. He held her gaze. I notice that you stay late on Tuesdays and leave early on Fridays because you visit your mother. I notice that you read during lunch, and you've gone through 4 different books since you started. I notice that you haven't replaced the mountain landscape print in your office, even though you look at it like you're thinking about it every time I pass the door. I notice that when you find something in a ledger that troubles you, you go still and quiet before you move, like you're running the numbers twice before you'll let yourself react. A pause. I notice everything about you, Nadia. I have since the night you sat down across from me and told me you were good at not being worth looking at. The room was quiet. Her name in his voice was something she hadn't prepared for. That's a lot of noticing, she said, because she had to say something. Because the alternative was silence, and she'd already spent too many years living in the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums. Yes, he said. It is. She looked at him. He looked back. Sign the Harmon Group memo, she said. I'll have the corrections filed by Thursday. I'll have Croft send it back this afternoon. She stood. He didn't look away. She picked up the file and walked to the door and stopped with her hand on the frame. Because she'd spent 6 weeks learning not to disappear. And she wasn't going to start again now. Dinner, she said without turning around. Friday. I know a place in the West Loop that has no mafia bosses and no coat rooms and extremely mediocre wine. A pause. I'll have a car ready at 7, he said. She nodded once and walked out into the hallway that smelled like wood smoke and expensive carpet, and the particular kind of order that comes when dangerous men build something they actually want to protect. Croft looked up from his desk as she passed and said nothing, which was one of the things she'd come to appreciate most about him. She went back to her office, sat down at her desk, looked at the mountain landscape on the wall across from her. Then she took it down, set it against the baseboard, and went back to work. The ledger copies she'd sent to 3 separate email addresses never needed to cancel. The charges against Fletcher Pruitt were filed in federal court 11 weeks later. His Delaware shell company was dissolved. The unnamed associate from the coat room. She eventually learned his name was a man they called Traeger, though she'd never see him in a courtroom. Took a deal that kept him out of the narrative but not out of consequence. Adrian Kane testified in a deposition and was home by noon. Nadia filed the last report on the Aurelius and Mace, internal audit on a Thursday, same as she'd promised, and by 3 o'clock she was already working on something else. That was the thing about numbers. They kept coming. The world kept generating transactions that needed to be read and reconciled and made honest. And there would always be people who tried to make them say things they didn't say, and there would always be a need for someone who could find what was being hidden. She was very good at finding things. She was also, it turned out, very good at being found. On the night of the Whitmore Club's winter gala, which she attended as she'd attended every quarterly for 4 years, except that this time she arrived with Adrian Kane, and the room rearranged itself not around him alone, but around the fact of them together. She wore a burgundy dress she'd bought, because she liked it and for no other reason, and she kept her chin up and she did not disappear. The string quartet was playing something she recognized this time. Something she'd heard once at a concert she'd attended alone, years ago, when she was still the kind of woman who went to things alone and told herself she didn't mind. She stood in the middle of a room full of the powerful and the dangerous and the deliberately unreadable, and Adrian Kane's hand was warm at the small of her back, and she didn't make herself smaller. She never would again.